The dragon who had nothing left. The morning Verath found the last of her shed scales was the morning she understood, with the particular clarity that only comes to those who have spent a very long time pretending otherwise, that she had arrived at the end of something. She knelt on the straw of the stable floor in the gray before dawn, her broad shoulders hunched beneath the low-beamed ceiling that had never been built with anything larger than a draft horse in mind, and she counted them into her palm. 4. Small ones no larger than her thumb, which was, by human reckoning, still the size of a man's fist, and already dulling at the edges to that muddy rust brown that told an alchemist they had been shed too long ago, the fire essence fading. She could almost hear the merchant sigh. She could almost see the way his eyes would slide sideways to the scale quality chart mounted on his wall, the one that graded by color and luminosity and the faint phosphorescent glow that fresh dragon scales carried in their first hours. These would not glow. These were the scales of an old woman who slept badly and ate less, and whose inner fire had been turned down over the years to something closer to a pilot light than the furnace it once was. 4 scales, perhaps 1.5 coins if the merchant was feeling generous. He would not be feeling generous. He was never generous on a morning when fog lay thick in the streets of Dun Kessara, which was every morning from the start of autumn through the miserable end of winter, and winter had decided to extend its visit this year as if it had nowhere better to be. Verath closed her fingers around the scales and sat back on her haunches and looked at the wall of the stable, which was stone up to a height of 4 feet and then timber frame above that, and which had a gap near the roofline where the boards had warped apart and let in a narrow blade of gray sky. She had been looking at that gap for 11 months. She had been meaning to stuff something into it to stop the cold coming through. She had not, because the cold did not particularly harm her, and because the gap was the only way she could see the stars at night. Lying on her back on the straw with her wings folded tight against her sides to fit in the space, and the stars they were the only things in Dun Kessara that asked nothing of her. She breathed out through her nostrils. A thin thread of smoke curled upward, dispersed, became nothing. 400 years was not old, not by the reckoning of her kind. She had a grandmother who had lived to 750 and a great-uncle. She was not fully certain of the relation. Clans were complicated, who some said had crossed 1,000 and was still somewhere in the northern mountain chains, sleeping or thinking or simply waiting in the profound way that truly ancient dragons waited, as if time were a river and they were boulders in it, and there was no urgency to being moved. 400 was the beginning of middle age, maybe. It was supposed to be the decade of consolidation, of taking stock, of looking at the territory one had established and the horde one had gathered and the name one had made in the particular geography of draconic reputation, and feeling something between satisfaction and ambition. She had a stable that was not hers and 4 dying scales. The comparison did not need to be drawn explicitly. It drew itself, with the quiet cruelty of all comparisons that have been avoided for too long and finally arrive at a moment when there is nothing left to distract from them. She had come to Dun Kessara 11 years ago. She was honest with herself about the why of it, at least in the dark before dawn when there was no one to perform dignity for. She had come because she had been pushed. The clan dispute, she did not think about the clan dispute in any detail, had not thought about it in detail for 8 years, had constructed very sturdy walls in her mind around the events of that period, and had become extremely competent at redirecting herself away from any approach to those walls, had ended in the way most clan disputes among her people ended, which was that the stronger party remained on the mountain and the weaker party left. She had been the weaker party. She had not always been, that was the part she least liked to approach. She had traveled south and then west and then south again, following the logic of necessity rather than preference, taking whatever work presented itself. She was large and fire-resistant and capable of flight, though the flight was harder than it had been 20 years prior, her left wing carrying an old injury that had healed imperfectly and pulled her to starboard in a stiff crosswind. She had hauled cargo over mountain passes that scared human drivers. She had provided warmth to winter encampments in exchange for food. She had served as a deterrent, the polite word was security consultant, for 3 different trade caravans crossing different stretches of bad road. And in each case her mere presence had been sufficient, because most bandits looked at something the size of Verath and chose to reconsider their career ambitions. She had arrived in Dun Kessara following a rumor, which was not an unusual method of navigation for those who had nothing holding them in one place. The rumor was that the city had established a formal contract system for non-human laborers, a sapient workers' charter, apparently a progressive document by regional standards, and that there was reliable work for those with unusual capabilities. Hauling, construction support. Fire suppression, which had made her laugh in a way she hadn't expected because of the particular irony of a fire-breathing creature being hired to suppress fire, but which was actually straightforward. She could identify and contain a burn faster than any human brigade, could walk through walls of flame that would kill a firefighting crew, could seal gaps and collapses with a controlled exhalation that no equipment could replicate. She had worked. For 3 years she had actually worked steadily and well, and there had been money enough for decent food and for a room in a boarding house that was cramped but real. And she had begun, cautiously, the way she did everything cautiously now, to feel something adjacent to stability. Then the merchant consortium had brought in the wyverns. Wyverns were not dragons. This was important to Verath and to no one else, which was in itself a particular kind of loneliness. Wyverns were smaller, less intelligent, easier to manage, easier to direct, and responded well to a system of conditioned reinforcement that was several important ethical grades below what could be done to a sapient being, but which fell into a convenient gray area when applied to a creature of limited cognitive complexity. They did not require the sapient workers' charter protections. They did not require fair wages or adequate food or respectful treatment. They could be worked harder and housed worse and paid in livestock rather than coin. And the consortium, which was made of people who had long ago discovered that efficiency was just cruelty with better marketing, had made the calculation quickly. Verath had been let go with 3 weeks' notice, and what a man in a good coat had described as a generous severance package, and which turned out to be enough money to last her 4 months if she was careful, 3 months if she was normal, and 2 months if she was what she actually was, which was a being of 400 years who had spent a long time not knowing how to be small. She had learned, slowly, expensively, with the humiliation that attends every lesson that comes too late, she had learned. The stable was free in exchange for minor maintenance and the psychological deterrent effect of being present. She ate what she could buy on the money from the scales, supplemented occasionally by the kitchen scraps that the stableman's wife left in a bucket near the back door with a deliberate casualness that allowed everyone to maintain the fiction that it was not charity. Verath ate the scraps at night, when no one was watching, and was grateful in the same silent way she was grateful for everything now, completely privately with no one to tell. She gathered herself off the floor, tucking the 4 scales into the worn leather pouch at her hip, and pushed through the stable door into the fog of Dun Kesara's morning. The Alchemist District was 40 minutes walk through streets that were built for humans and accommodated Verath only in the sense that they did not actively prevent her passage. She walked at the edges, close to the buildings on her right, which gave the merchants setting up their stalls on her left a maximum amount of space to feel comfortable in. She had learned this too, the spatial politics of being large in a place that was not built for you. Walk at the edges. Keep your wings folded flat against your back. Drop your head a few inches below its natural height, not so low as to seem threatening, not a predator crouch, just a slight reduction that communicated I am aware of the space I occupy, and I am making myself smaller in acknowledgement of your ownership of it. Watch the expressions on faces. Navigate around the ones that were moving toward alarm. She passed a baker's window and the smell hit her with the specific cruelty of things one cannot afford. Bread with rosemary, something sweet underneath, the deep warm brown smell of something that had been in the oven at exactly the right temperature for exactly the right amount of time. She kept walking. She had long ago learned that the second you stopped at a bakery window with no money in your pocket, you became a story in someone's day. There was a dragon looking at the bread. Can you imagine? And she had enough stories told about her without contributing to the collection. The alchemist's shop was narrow and tall and smelled of sulfur and dried herbs and the particular acrid sharpness of whatever he was currently distilling in the back room. Melvith was his name. He was a small man with large hands and a jeweler's loop that he wore pushed up onto his forehead even when he wasn't using it, as if he had simply forgotten it was there for so many years that its presence had become structural. He was not a bad man. He was a thorough man, which in commerce was not exactly the same thing as a good one. He examined the scales with the loop and the manner of someone performing a duty. "Color is poor," he said. "Yes," she said. "You know I can only go by the charts." "Oh, yes." The luminosity is almost gone on this one. He held the largest scale up to the window. Even Verath could see the problem. It sat dull in the gray morning light, no different from a piece of reddish slate. Chart puts this in category 4, 1 3/4 the lot. She had expected 1 1/2. The additional quarter copper was small enough that she should not have felt the relief she felt. She felt it anyway and hated feeling it, which was a specific kind of exhaustion she had no language for. "That's fair," she said. He counted out the coins with the careful movements of someone for whom each coin was a small but real object, and she took them and put them in the pouch next to where the scales had been, and she left. The fog had thickened while she was inside. She could see perhaps 30 feet clearly, and then the world dissolved into gray, shapes moving in it that might have been carts or people or simply the fog itself rearranging. She stood on the step outside the alchemist's and thought about nothing in particular, which was something she had become very practiced at. Thinking about particular things tended to lead to thinking about the mountain, or about the state of her wings, or about the fact that 400 years into a life she had expected to matter more than this. She was standing in a fog with 1 3/4 copper and a pouch that still smelled faintly of scale dust. She had turned back toward the stable district, choosing the route that avoided the baker when the wind shifted. She smelled it before she heard anything, before the first shout, before the glow had made itself visible through the fog. Fire. The wrong kind. A dragon knew fire the way fish knew water, from the inside as the medium of existence, as the element that lived in her lungs and passed through her body and expressed the most essential parts of what she was. She knew the smell of her own flame and the smell of a hearth, and the smell of oil lamps and candles and the small dignified fires that humans kept controlled and purposeful. She knew the smell of wildfire from the mountains, the particular violent green smoke scent of it when it moved through living wood, and the smell of a forge when the bellows were worked too hard, and the smell of accidental fire, the kind that started from a coal falling wrong or a lamp knocked over with its note of surprise in it. That early sharp smell of this was not supposed to happen. This was the last kind, but advanced well past surprise and into the territory of catastrophe. There was thatch in it, and old timber, the kind that had been drying for decades in a building that was built when anyone who needed building standards didn't live there. There was the chemical sweetness of whatever someone had been using to treat the floorboards. And beneath it all, wound through the smoke like a thread pulled tight, the hot copper smell of living creatures in extremis, the particular biological signal that a body put out when it understood that it was running out of time. More than one, adults and she stopped walking, stood absolutely still in the fog, and breathed in slowly with every olfactory sense she possessed, sorting through the layers of the smell with the precision of a century's practice. A child-high third floor perhaps. The direction was she turned following the invisible line of the scent and found the glow through the fog. Orange-red poolsing wrong. She was moving before the decision fully formed. This was something she had noticed about herself over the long years, that her body often made choices several seconds ahead of her mind, that in moments of genuine urgency, the elaborate machinery of deliberation simply switched off and left something simpler and older in charge. It was not heroism. She was honest enough with herself to know it was not heroism. It was the oldest instinct she had, older than language and older than anything the clan had tried to teach her about her own nature. When something small was in danger, the body moved. She dropped the coin pouch somewhere. She was aware of it leaving her hand. She did not process where it fell. The street was called Copper Lane. She knew it by reputation as the part of the city where the buildings had been old before anyone currently alive was born, and had been added to and subdivided and filled with the particular density of people who needed to live inexpensively and in close proximity to the parts of the city where other people needed cheap labor. The tenement at the far end was 4 stories of timber and old stone and thatch, and it was burning the way old things burned when they had spent their whole lives drying out, completely, quickly, and with a kind of total commitment that left no room for argument. There were people in the street. A crowd had formed with the terrible swiftness that crowds formed around disasters, some of them carrying buckets that were already clearly inadequate, some of them simply standing with the stillness of people who were watching something that their minds had categorized as beyond their ability to affect. There was screaming, multiple voices, the wordless kind. And cutting through it, directional, coming from a woman in a nightdress near the front of the crowd. A kind of shouting that was not wordless at all, but which was in a dialect Verath didn't fully know. She knew what pointing meant. 3rd floor, the window at the corner where the shutter had broken and hung at an angle. A hand against the glass, a small hand, pale with heat and pressure. The hand of something that understood it was trapped but did not yet fully understand everything that implied. She hit the front of the crowd and the crowd parted. Not because they chose to, because she was moving at a pace that didn't allow for choosing, and she was the size that she was, and there was simply no version of not parting that didn't end badly. She heard someone fall backward. She heard someone else say something in a voice that was pure disbelief. She did not stop. She had not stopped. The front door of the building was wood and had already warped from the heat inside, swollen in its frame, sealed shut by the physics of fire. She hit it with her shoulder, and it did not so much open as cease to exist as a door, splintering into several pieces that the fire welcomed immediately with enthusiasm. She went through the gap she had made, and the fire said hello to her with a roar of displaced air, a great warm exhalation, and she did not flinch because there was nothing in this that could hurt her. The fire that lived in her was older than any fire that started by accident, and she recognized the family resemblance, and the fire recognized her back, and there was an understanding between them that did not extend to it harming her. The interior of the building was a vertical oven. The ground floor was almost entirely gone, not the structure, not yet, but the accessible space, the breathable zone, the place where a human body could exist. The staircase on the left side was burning freely, the banister a line of flame, each step a layer of orange, but staircases were only one option. She found the main structural beam running up through the center of the building with her hands and her instinct, and the particular spatial sense that 4 centuries of navigating mountain passages had given her. And she gripped it with claws that had not lost their strength regardless of what else had been lost, and she climbed. The smoke was the true difficulty. Even for her, the smoke was extraordinary, a thick, hot, total darkness that had swallowed the building above the ground floor. She swept one wing forward in a slow arc, displacing it, pushing a pocket of cleaner air ahead of her as she moved, an old technique from a different life when she had entered burning structures for different reasons. She called out as she climbed. 3 languages, one draconic phrase that no child would understand but which felt necessary to announce herself. I am not a new danger, I am something else. I am something that came to find you. Second floor landing. The hall was still intact but would not be for long. She felt the floor flex beneath her weight in ways that had nothing to do with solidity and everything to do with the fire consuming the joinery below. She moved quickly, which was something she did not always have available but could access under the right conditions, and the right conditions were these. Third floor, she nearly missed the door. It was closed, which had saved the room behind it from the worst of the smoke, and it looked like every other section of burning wall until she registered the gap at the bottom, cooler air differential, barely, but enough. She hit the door with her foreleg and it went inward. The room was small. A child's room, or a room that had been appropriated as one. There was a cot frame and a trunk, and the remains of something on the wall that might have been a picture. The window with the broken shutter was at the far end. Smoke had come under the door before she arrived and collected near the ceiling in a gray layer, but below it the air was still bearable, and beneath the overturned bed in the corner, which had been heavy enough and low enough to the floor to create a small sheltered space, was a boy. He was 6, perhaps 7. She could not be precise about human ages. He had brown hair that was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and his face was flushed past red and into an alarming territory, and he had both hands pressed against the floor beneath the overturned bed as if trying to anchor himself to something that was staying put. His eyes found her in the doorway and went very wide. She had seen that expression before. It was the expression of a child who has spent some unknowable amount of time being terrified, who has moved through all the permutations of terror and come out somewhere past it, somewhere quieter and more fundamental, and who upon seeing something new and enormous in the doorway has exhausted their capacity for surprise and is waiting to find out what this new thing means. She crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt. The ceiling was too low for her to stand fully. This was a human room, a human ceiling, a human world, and she folded herself down to the floor and looked at him directly, which she had learned was always better than looking at a frightened child from above. I have you, she said. She said it in the common tongue first, then the dialect, then once more in common in case the repetition helped. Her voice was low and she controlled it carefully because her full voice in a small room would have been itself alarming. I have you now. I am going to carry you out. You will be safe. Do you hear me? The boy looked at her. His chest was heaving with short, rapid breaths. He nodded once, a tiny movement, the most economical possible confirmation. She unfolded her wing, the right one, the good one, the one that moved without the pull of the old injury, and wrapped it around him. The membrane was tough and fire-resistant and held the warmth of her body, and she felt him go still against her the way small creatures went still when they found themselves unexpectedly enclosed in something warm and large enough to hold them, the ancient calming that was older than thought. She pulled him close to her chest and rose. Back down the beam. The smoke worse now, the wing clearing it in great slow strokes, the boy's face pressed against her sternum where the air was cleanest. She moved faster than she had moved in years, not fast by the standards of her youth, not the mountain-running speed of a dragon in her prime, but steadily and without hesitation, and the fire stepped back from her path with what she could only describe as respect. The way fire always had, the way fire recognized something that it could not consume. She came out of the hole she had made in the front wall. The crowd in the street went completely silent. She did not look at them. She walked forward several paces, away from the burning building, and she knelt again on the cobblestones and unfolded her wing carefully, deliberately, the way one opens something that mattered. The boy tumbled gently against the ground, sat up, and immediately began coughing, deep, productive coughs, the good kind, the kind that meant the lungs were clearing themselves. His face was streaked with soot in lines that followed the paths his tears had taken. His eyes were very bright. She settled back on her haunches and watched him breathe, and the watching was more important to her in that moment than she would have been able to explain if anyone had asked. His hands found her foreleg, both of them small fingers wrapping around the scaled surface, gripping with the surprising strength that frightened children always had. He held on. The woman from before, nightdress, bare feet on the cobblestones, the one who had been pointing, arrived at a run and fell to her knees beside him, pulling him in, holding him the way a person held something they had been terrified of losing. She was speaking in that dialect Verath didn't fully know, fast and low and broken in the way language broke when the body had been running on crisis chemicals for too long. The boy let himself be held, but he turned his head over his mother's shoulder and looked at Verath. "Are you an angel?" he asked. She looked at herself, the dull scales, the worn claws, the wing she was already folding back with the slight hitch of the old injury pulling on the tendon, the threadbare, tired, practical fact of who she was. "No," she said, "I am simply what was available." He looked at her with those bright eyes, the eyes of someone who had just rearranged every category they used to understand the world, and said nothing more. But he did not let go of her foreleg until his mother lifted him gently and turned him toward the crowd. Somewhere behind her the building let out a long, low groan, and the third floor fell inward. Verath did not watch. She was looking at the cobblestones and at the small handprints of soot the boy had left on her foreleg, and she was remembering, with the odd sharp clarity of things that arrive unexpectedly, what it had felt like to be needed. She found her coin pouch near the edge of the crowd. It was still there, 1 3/4 copper, undisturbed, as if the world had briefly set something aside for her. She picked it up. She stood in the street while the city watch arrived and the bucket brigade finally made its futile stand against the ruins of the building. And she breathed in the cooling night air and the smoke, and underneath both of them, faint but present, the particular smell of something that had been very close to ending and then had not. She did not know the boy's name yet. She did not know that his father was coming home from somewhere between the stars. She knew only that she had been what was available, and that for once, for the first time in a long time, available had been enough. The ones who ask questions after. The city watch arrived in the way that city watches always arrived. Organized, official, and approximately 12 minutes too late for any of it to matter. There were 4 of them, led by a corporal who wore his uniform with the particular stiffness of someone who had recently been promoted and had not yet grown comfortable with the authority the uniform implied. He was young, mid-20s perhaps, with a sparse beard that he was cultivating with more hope than success, and he carried a leather ledger under one arm that he produced with the practiced gesture of a man who had decided, somewhere early in his career, that documentation was the part of the job he could always do correctly even when everything else was uncertain. He stopped when he saw Verath. He stopped the way people stopped when they had been expecting a situation, and arrived to find that the situation had been substantially upgraded in scale. His eyes moved from Verath to the building, still smoldering, still settling, making the low structural complaints of something that had given everything it had, and then back to Verath. And she could see him recalibrating in real time, fitting what he was seeing into whatever framework his training had given him for non-standard incident response. She waited. She had learned over the years that waiting was the most useful thing she could do when a person in a uniform was trying to understand her. Any movement she made while they were still processing would be interpreted through whatever fear they were carrying, and fear was an unreliable translator. "You," the corporal said, and then stopped, because you was not a sentence. "Yes," Verath said, giving him the gift of a full stop to begin from. He cleared his throat, opened the ledger, found a blank page with the focus of a man who was using the search as a moment to collect himself. "There's been the building," he looked up. "Were you the one who entered the structure?" "Oh, yes." "And removed the child?" "Oh, yes." He wrote something. Whatever he wrote appeared to steady him, because when he looked up again, his expression had moved from disorganized alarm toward something more closely resembling professional function. "I need to take your name and status, for the record." "Verath," she said. "Dragon, no municipal registration." She added the last part before he could ask it, because she had been through enough of these conversations to know the order in which the questions arrived. The corporal's pen paused above the page. "No charter." "No charters." Under the Dun Kesara Civil Emergency Code, Section 14, unauthorized entry into. "I am aware of Section 14, Verath said without heat. "I am prepared to discuss it." He looked at her. He looked at the crowd of 50-odd people who were watching this exchange with the focused attention of an audience that had already seen one extraordinary thing tonight and was prepared to see another. He looked at the boy, Tamaz. She did not know his name yet. She was still calling him the boy in her mind, who was sitting on the cobblestones 3 feet from her foreleg, wrapped in a blanket that had appeared from somewhere in the crowd, eating bread that had appeared from somewhere else, watching the corporal with the candid, evaluating gaze of a child who had not yet learned to pretend he wasn't making judgments. The corporal looked back at Verath. "You're aware," he said carefully, "that the section carries a potential fine." "Oh, yes." "And that the fine structure for non-chartered emergency intervention is," he was clearly trying to remember the specific figure. "It's tiered, Based on there are several factors. I imagine there are. A long pause, the fire behind them cracked and settled. Someone in the crowd coughed. I'm going to note, the corporal said, with the deliberateness of a man composing a sentence that would survive review, that the intervention was, I'm going to note successful response in the nature field. And I'm going to note that the reporting officer assessed no ongoing risk from the involved party. He wrote this down. He wrote it with the thoroughness of someone who was building a paper record that would justify a decision he had already made in a way that his supervisor could not easily argue with. You'll need to present yourself at the Civil Administration Office within 3 days for formal documentation. I will, she said. He nodded, wrote a few more things, and then looked up with an expression that had shed most of its official quality and become briefly, plainly human. For what it's worth, he said quietly, the administration office is going to be very full of people who don't care about the charter. She understood what he meant. She did not say so because there was no way to acknowledge it that would not embarrass him. She simply dipped her head slightly, a gesture that was not quite a bow but communicated receipt of the sentiment, and he moved away to begin his measurements and his diagrams and the rest of the machinery that institutions required to process the fact that something had happened. The woman's name was Ilna. Verath learned this from the neighbor who had produced the blanket, a stout woman in a heavy coat who delivered information with the efficiency of someone who had lived in close proximity to others for long enough that their stories had become continuous with her own. Al-Nasarath, the neighbor said, appearing at Verath's elbow with the confident proximity of someone who had decided that standing next to a dragon was not a particular risk given what they'd already witnessed tonight. Her sister married a spacer. The husband, he's been out there, she gestured upward with a vagueness that encompassed everything above the city's rooftops. For months now, Alna's been managing alone, 2 jobs. The boy's been, she lowered her voice, he's been good, that one. Good boy. Better than the situation deserves. Verath did not reply. She was watching Ilna, who was still on her knees on the cobblestones with the boy held against her chest, speaking to him in a voice too low to carry, her hand moving over his hair in slow, repetitive strokes that were for her own steadying as much as his. The way a person held something they had nearly lost was different from the way they held everything else. Verath had observed this many times across many species, across 4 centuries of watching the specific theater of what beings did in the aftermath of near catastrophe. There was a quality to it that did not exist in ordinary contact, a held breath made physical, a continuous awareness of the fact that the hands were full and the alternative was that they would have been empty. She knew distantly and from a direction she did not approach directly what that felt like. Ilna eventually gathered herself. She rose from the cobblestones with the slow, controlled movements of someone whose legs had gone uncertain, pressed the boy to her hip with one arm, and turned to face Verath with the expression of a person who had prepared a speech and was now discovering that all the words had gone somewhere else. What came out was simpler. I have no money to give you, she said. It came out on an exhale, direct and stripped of any attempt at softening. I want to, I would if I had anything. You don't need to, Verath said. I know I don't need to, that's not. Ilna stopped, started again. Her voice was steadier the second time, though the effort of making it so was visible. You went into that building for him, you didn't know him. No. He's everything, Ilna said, which was not an explanation so much as a statement of cosmology, of the particular way certain people organized their entire understanding of what mattered around a single point. He's everything. I know, Verath said, though she meant it differently, not that she knew Tamaz was everything to Ilna, but that she recognized the everything, recognized the structure of it, recognized how a person looked when they were describing the center of their own gravity. Ilna said it again, and once more after that. The third time her voice broke slightly at the end, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and brought herself back. She was a person, Verath understood, who had been holding a great deal together for a long time and who was experiencing the particular difficulty of falling apart when the danger was over rather than while it was happening. The body was thoughtless in that way. It held you together through the crisis and then handed you the bill the moment you were safe. Verath said it was all right. She said it twice. Then she stopped saying it because Ilna needed to say the other thing more than she needed to hear any particular response to it. What Verath did not expect was the boy. She had been peripherally aware of him throughout the exchange with Ilna and the corporal and the neighbor with the information, because he was close to her foreleg and close was the kind of proximity she tracked automatically. But she had assumed he was occupied with the bread and the blanket and the aftermath of nearly dying, which was a significant occupation by any measure, and she had not expected him to be watching her. Not with the shocky, unfocused stare that children sometimes had after frightening experiences, but with the specific focused attention of someone actively engaged in observing. He was eating the bread with the methodical thoroughness of a person who understood that food was important and was not going to let the events of the evening prevent him from eating it properly. Between bites, he watched her. His eyes were a warm brown, lit just now with the ambient orange of the dying fire and the lanterns the watch had brought, and they had in them the particular quality of eyes that were recording everything they saw and filing it away with the intention of understanding it later. Children who watched like that made Verath feel, in a way she could not fully articulate, less like a piece of furniture in the landscape and more like a thing that existed specifically and intentionally. It was uncomfortable and also something else. "You live in the stables," he said. He said it with no particular inflection, not as an accusation, not as a question with an expected answer, simply as a statement of something he was establishing as fact before proceeding further. "Yes," she said. "The one near the East Market. Mika's brother works there." A pause for bread. "He said there was a dragon in the back stable. He said she was very old and slept a lot." "Mika's brother is correct about the stable," Verath said. "He is not correct about the age." The boy considered this. "How old are you?" 407. "That sounds old." "For a human, for a dragon, it is middle age approximately." He thought about this with the serious thoughtfulness of someone who was actually processing it rather than just moving through the social motions. "So you're like a 40-year-old, he said. "In relative terms, perhaps." "My papa is 38, he said, as if this made the comparison concrete and therefore satisfying. He ate more bread. "Then that's not a good place to live, the stable." There was no cruelty in it, no performance of concern, no adult-shaped sympathy that was really just an assertion of one's own better circumstances. It was simply an observation, factual, offered in the same register as the rest. "No," Verath agreed, "it is not." "Our building burned down," he said, with the candor of a child who had not yet learned that there were events one softened in the telling. He looked back at the building, which was still visible at the end of the street, collapsed into itself, the fire banked now to embers by the bucket brigade's late and insufficient effort. "So now we don't have a good place either." He looked back at her. "We're the same." Verath regarded him for a moment. "We are not precisely the same," she said. "But kind of." He held her gaze with the calm certainty of someone who had made a categorization and found it sound. He was not asking for agreement. He was reporting a finding. She had no argument that felt worth making. The comparison was, in its blunt and undecorated way, not entirely wrong. They were two beings sitting on cobblestones in the cold with no building to return to, one of them eating bread and one of them watching, and the structural similarity was what it was regardless of what else differed between them. She said nothing. He ate the last of the bread and brushed the crumbs from his fingers with a decisiveness that suggested the bread portion of the evening was concluded and other things were now going to be addressed. Alna eventually found them a destination, a cousin on the far side of the city. She explained to the neighbor, someone who had a spare room and who had been sent for. The city watch helped arrange a cart. The neighbor pressed food into Alna's hands. The small machinery of community operating in the aftermath of disaster, everyone doing the one thing they could do, the accumulation of small things adding up to something that barely reached sufficient. Alna took Tamaz by the hand. He went. He was obedient without being passive, cooperative without being empty, and he walked beside his mother with the slightly too upright posture of a child who was managing himself carefully because he understood that the adults around him were at capacity. At the corner of the street, where the lamplight ended and the fog of the city proper began, Alna turned back and looked at Verath for a long moment with an expression that said everything she had failed to say earlier and still couldn't find words for. Verath dipped her head again, the same gesture she had made to the corporal, and Alna turned away. Tamaz had already turned the corner, but he stopped. Verath heard the small sound of his feet on the cobblestones before she saw him. He had turned back, facing her across the length of the street, his borrowed blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his face serious and illuminated by the last lamppost. "My papa will want to thank you," he called out across the space between them. His voice was clear and carried well, the voice of a child who had not yet learned to modulate himself for public spaces. "He's coming home soon. He's been very far away." She looked at him, the fog moved between them. "He does not need to thank me," she said. "He will anyway," Tamaz said, with an absoluteness that was not stubbornness but something quieter, the confidence of someone stating a property of a person they knew completely. "He's like that." Then he was gone around the corner, and the street was empty except for Verath and the smoldering remains and the city watch finishing their measurements and the neighbor going home, and the fog coming back in to fill the space where people had been. She found her coin pouch. It had fallen near the gutter at the edge of the crowd, just inside the boundary where the lamplight reached, and it sat on the cobblestones with the undisturbed patience of an object that had simply waited to be retrieved. 1 3/4 copper, confirmed by touch when she picked it up, the exact same amount she had walked away from the alchemists with. The building had burned and a boy had nearly died, and a woman had said he's everything and a child had said we're the same. And the pouch weighed exactly the same as it had before any of it happened. She thought for a moment about the way events redistributed themselves in the world without redistributing the material reality of things. You could walk into a burning building and carry something irreplaceable out of it and come back to the street and still have 1 3/4 copper, and the copper did not know what had happened. The copper was indifferent. The copper was the same copper it had always been. She tucked the pouch away and started back toward the stable district. The streets of Dunkesara at this hour were not empty. Cities this size were never fully empty. There was always the layer of life that preferred the dark, the workers on odd shifts and the insomniacs and the people whose circumstances had reorganized them outside the standard rhythms. But they were quiet enough that her footsteps were audible, the particular sound of clawed feet on old stone, measured and even. She kept to the edges. She kept her wings folded. She passed a window with warm light behind it and the sound of low voices. A family still awake at this hour for reasons she did not know, and she walked past it without pausing. She was aware of something that she could not immediately name. It was not warmth exactly. She was physically warm by nature, and the night's cold registered to her only as an absence of additional heat rather than a presence of anything uncomfortable. It was not satisfaction, which she associated with the completion of things one had planned to do. It was something smaller and stranger than either, the residue of having been, for a span of time, entirely present. Of having had a direction that was not chosen but recognized, and of having moved toward it without the slow friction of deliberation. She did not think further about the father who was coming home from somewhere very far away. She noted the statement, filed it in the shallow part of memory where things went that were probably unimportant, and let the fog take it. She arrived at the stable. She pushed through the door. She arranged herself on the straw, wings folded tight to fit the space, and looked up through the gap in the boards at the sky. The fog had thinned at this edge of the city, and through the gap she could see, if she looked directly and did not let her eyes drift, a handful of stars, dim with the city's light but present. The same stars she had watched from a mountain that no longer had her name on it, from a valley she had crossed once at full speed just to feel the wind resistance, from a dozen different rooftops in a dozen different cities over the course of 11 years of elsewhere. The boy had held on to her foreleg, both hands, small fingers gripping scales that had lost their luster, holding on the way small creatures held on to things that were large enough to feel like permanence. She had not been anyone's permanence in a very long time. She breathed out. A thin thread of smoke spiraled upward toward the gap in the roof, and through it, and into the night above the city where the stars were, and she watched it go until it became indistinguishable from the dark. She did not sleep for some time. When she did not dream about anything that she could remember afterward. 3 mornings after that, the sky behaved in a way that sky was not supposed to. She heard it first. She was awake before dawn. She was almost always awake before dawn. Dawn was when the stable was quietest and the streets outside had not yet started their noise, and the gap in the boards showed her the specific blue of early morning that she found she could look at without the complicated feelings that the full daylight sometimes brought. She was awake and the stable was quiet, and the city outside was making only its lowest background sounds, and then the low background sounds were joined by something that was not a part of them. It was a frequency rather than a sound at first, something that she felt in her sternum before she heard it with her ears, a resonance low and building, the kind of vibration that very large things moving very fast made in the air around them. She had heard this once before in a different context in a different century, the sound that certain large aerial creatures made when they dropped from a very high altitude at speed that was not quite controlled and not quite free fall but something between the two. But this was not a creature. She understood that immediately, though she could not have said precisely what told her. The quality of it was wrong for something alive. It was too regular, too continuous, too deliberately shaped. She unfolded herself from the straw and went out of the stable into the pre-dawn street, and she looked up. And she saw the streak of it crossing the sky from the eastern horizon, a white line, brilliant even against the fatting dark, with a color at its leading edge that was not fire exactly but was fire adjacent in the way that very fast things moving through air always produce something fire adjacent. It was slowing. She could see the slowing even at this distance. Whatever it was not falling uncontrolled. It was arriving. The streak resolved as it descended. The brilliance faded as the speed reduced, and beneath the light she began to see the edges of a shape, geometry that had nothing to do with anything natural. Straight lines, deliberate angles, the profile of something that had been constructed rather than grown, built for forces she could not name, carrying the visual language of a purpose she did not have words for. It came down in the old market square, which was a large flat space at the city's center that had served as a gathering place since before the current buildings were built. And the cobblestones of the square blackened in a perfect circle as the thing descended into it, and the sound of its landing traveled through the ground before it traveled through the air. A deep and final thud that was nothing like a crash and everything like a period at the end of a sentence. Silence. Then the city slowly began to wake up around what had arrived in it. Verath stood in the street outside the stable and looked in the direction of the market square, which was far enough away that she could not see it, but close enough that she could feel the residual heat of its descent spreading through the morning air. She stood there for a long moment with the specific quality of stillness that was not the absence of motion, but the presence of attention, listening, scenting, processing the information available to her about what had just happened. She had not moved. She would move in a moment. She understood that something was beginning, though she could not yet have described what it was beginning toward. She thought about the boy. She thought about what he had said, standing at the corner of the street in a borrowed blanket, his voice carrying clearly through the fog. He's been very far away. She looked at the sky, which was lightening now from deep blue toward the gray gold of actual morning, and at the place where the white streak had already dissolved into nothing, as if the sky had absorbed the evidence of passage and was presenting itself as ordinary again. She breathed in slowly. Through the wood smoke and the morning cold and the distant smell of bread beginning somewhere in the city, there was something new, an edge, sharp and chemical and not of this world. The specific scent of something that had been between stars and still carried that in its material self, the cold of the void not yet fully shed. She put her coin pouch in the stable. She did not know why she did this. She simply found herself doing it, setting down the thing she had been carrying, leaving it behind, walking out into the morning with her hands empty. The market square was 40 minutes away at her pace. She began to walk. What comes after fire? The market square of Dun Kesara had been many things across its long history. It had been a place of execution in the city's harder centuries, when the center of a settlement was considered the appropriate location for the kind of theater that power performed for the benefit of those it governed. It had been a market, obviously, persistently, stubbornly, the name outlasting every attempt to repurpose the space, where 3 mornings a week the vendors came with their carts and their folding tables and their specific expertise in the particular products of specific regions, and the square filled with the noise and smell of commerce being conducted with varying degrees of honesty. It had been a gathering place for celebrations and for mourning, and for the kind of spontaneous civic congregation that happened when something large enough to require collective processing occurred in a city's life. It had never, in any of its recorded or unrecorded histories, contained a vessel that had arrived from between the stars. The vessel sat in the center of the square with the absolute stillness of something that had come to rest after a very long journey and was not in any hurry to move again. It was long, perhaps 30 meters, though Verath's sense of human measurements was approximate, and its profile was angular in ways that spoke of purpose rather than aesthetic, of engineering done by people who cared about function and had not had the luxury of worrying about beauty. Its surface was the color that Verath would later struggle to describe to anyone who asked. Not black, because black was the absence of light and this was something different, the darkness of something that had existed in a place where light was very sparse and very distant, and had taken on, over time, the quality of that place the way cloth took on the smell of wherever it was stored. It was the color of deep space. It did not reflect the morning light so much as acknowledge it minimally, the way a very reserved person acknowledged a greeting. The square around it was empty of the usual morning foot traffic. People had gathered at the edges, she could see them as she came down the approach street, the clusters at each entrance to the square, standing in the particular posture of people who are very interested in something and simultaneously uncertain whether approaching it is advisable. Some had the look of the recently awakened, robes over nightclothes, hair suggesting interrupted sleep. Some had the look of people who had been awake and working and had felt the landing and come to see. All of them were looking at the vessel with the focused collective attention of a city that was updating its understanding of what the world contained. Verath walked through the gathering at the eastern entrance. People stepped aside for her in the way people stepped aside for her, and she came out into the empty space of the square and stopped. She was aware that she was also a thing being looked at. A dragon standing at the edge of a cleared square in the early morning regarding an interstellar vessel. This was not ordinary. Nothing about the current configuration of the market square was ordinary, but she was a visible and identified piece of the unusualness, and the gathered crowd was distributing its attention between the vessel and her with the evaluating quality of an audience that suspected the two things were related. She did not know if they were related. She thought about the boy at the corner of the street. He's been very far away. She stood and waited, because this was what she did, and because the waiting felt less like patience and more like the specific quality of attention that very large events required before you moved in them. The ramp descended from the vessel's lower section with a sound that was barely a sound at all, a breath of hydraulics, a whisper of mechanism, the kind of engineering that was so precise it had eliminated almost all its own noise. It came down at a shallow angle and met the scorched cobblestones of the square with the lightest of contacts, and the light of the morning fell on it, and it was just a ramp, practical and utilitarian, the same as any ramp from any vehicle except that this one had last touched ground in a different star system. The man who walked down it did not walk the way Verath had expected a person who had fallen from space to walk. She had not known what she expected precisely, something more declarative perhaps, something with more ceremony given the circumstances, the vessel, the scorched square, the crowd at the edges, the whole improbable theater of the morning. She had expected the walk of someone who was aware they were being watched and had organized themselves accordingly, which was the walk of every important person she had encountered in 4 centuries. He walked without any of that. He walked down the ramp and across the scorched stone with the focus of a man who had a direction and was moving toward it, and the focus was so total and so unperformed that it took her a moment to understand that it was not indifference to the watching. He was aware he was being watched. She could see that in the controlled quality of his movement, but something more precise than indifference, a decision made and maintained not to let the watching change anything. He was tall and lean in the way of people whose occupation kept their bodies functional rather than comfortable, and his face had the weathered quality of someone who had spent significant time in environments that were not designed with human skin in mind. He wore no uniform that Verath recognized and no armor of any kind, but he carried himself with the remembered shape of both, the posture of someone for whom authority was not a performance, but a habit so old it had become structural. His eyes were the thing she noticed last and then could not stop noticing. They were dark and clear, and they had in them the particular quality she had only ever seen in things that had spent extended time looking at very long distances. Mountains had that quality, and certain oceans, and old dragons who had lived alone on high peaks for decades at a time. The eyes of something that had looked at distances that changed the internal geometry of a person, that reorganized what near and far meant in a way that didn't fully reverse when you came back to a place where walls were close and ceilings were low. He crossed the square and stopped 3 feet from her and looked at her directly, without the cataloging that most people did, without the scan from feet to head that was really just the body assessing risk and dressing it up as curiosity. He looked at her face. "You're the dragon," he said. "I am a dragon," she said, because it mattered, and because she found in the moment that she still had enough of herself left to say so. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the shift of muscles that acknowledged a point made. "The one who pulled my son out of the fire," he said. The morning was very quiet around them. The crowd at the edges of the square had gone so still that Verath could hear the distant sounds of the city beyond, a cart somewhere, a dog, the ordinary machinery of a morning that was proceeding normally in parts of Dun Kesara that did not have a starship in their market square. "Your son is well," she said. "I am glad I was nearby." He looked at her for a moment, a long one, and she had the sense that he was doing something she did not have a precise name for, not assessing in the way of people who were calculating advantage, not observing in the way of people who were cataloging the unusual. Something more like recognition, the look of someone who was seeing a specific thing and identifying it correctly. "My name is Commander Aaron Vaseth," he said. "I owe you a debt that I intend to pay." "You owe me nothing," Verath said. "It was the right thing to do." "Yes," he said, simply without argument. "It was, and that makes the debt larger, not smaller." He paused, and in the pause she heard him choosing words with the care of someone for whom precision in language was a professional discipline. "Anyone who does the right thing when they have nothing to gain from it," he looked at her, and she knew that he had seen what she had been trying not to perform, the dullness of the scales and the worn quality of the claws and the whole accumulated material evidence of 11 years of barely sufficient. "And you have nothing. I can see that, so don't tell me otherwise." She began. "That person," he continued with the quiet of someone finishing a sentence that had been interrupted but was not derailed, "is owed something by the universe whether they want it or not, and I am currently the universe's representative in this square." He held her gaze steadily. "So." Verath looked at him for a long moment. There was something disorienting about being seen accurately. She had spent a long time managing the way she was perceived, not dishonestly, not through any active misrepresentation, but through the practiced art of presenting the most functional version of her circumstances and declining to volunteer the parts that invited pity. Pity was a transaction she did not want to enter into because it required her to accept a position of diminishment, and she had clung to the refusal of that position with a tenacity that had sometimes come at the cost of more practical needs. This man had looked at her for 40 seconds and had declined to participate in the management. "I have questions," she said, because questions were ground she knew. "I have answers," he said, "and resources, and a son who has talked about nothing but the dragon lady for 3 days." This time the precursor became the thing itself, a brief, real smile there and then controlled, the smile of a man who did not wear his feelings casually but could not entirely suppress them when they were large enough. "He says you told him you were just what was available." "It was accurate." "It was wrong," he said, and the directness of it landed without weight, without the quality of a correction delivered to diminish. "You were exactly what was needed. There is a difference. Available implies accident. Needed implies something essential about what you are." He tilted his head slightly toward the vessel behind him. "Will you come aboard? I have food. I don't know what you eat, I should have asked, but I carry enough variety that something will work. I have coffee, which I've been told is consumed on this world. I have warmth and a place to sit that isn't a cobblestone and a conversation I would like to start." She looked at the vessel. She looked at the man who had fallen from the sky because his son would not stop talking about her. She thought about the coin pouch she had left in the stable, 1¾ copper. She thought about Melvith and his quality chart. She thought about the gap in the stable boards and the stars through it, and the way she had made herself small enough to fit in a space that was not built for her. "I eat most things," she said. "Good," he said, "come on then." The interior of the vessel was the first space Verath had been inside in 11 years that had not required her to make herself smaller to occupy it. She understood as she crossed the threshold and the ceiling rose, and the corridors widened into what was clearly a common space designed for assembly rather than passage, that this had not been an accident of design. The architecture was human in its fundamental proportions. The ergonomics of handles and panels and seating said clearly that humans had built this for humans. But the main space had clearance and width that went beyond what any purely human crew would have required, and there were structural choices that made sense only if the designer had accommodated the possibility of larger passengers. She noted this. She did not comment on it. She filed it alongside everything else she was quietly learning about Aaron Vaseth in the interval since he had walked down his ramp, that he thought ahead, that he prepared, that his preparations were specific rather than general. He brought food. True to his word, there was variety, things she did not recognize in packaging that meant nothing to her alongside things she did recognize, and the things she recognized were substantial, the kind of caloric density she had not been able to afford in months. She ate without pretending she wasn't hungry, which was something she could not always manage. He did not watch her eat in the way people sometimes watched her eat, with the fascinated anthropological gaze of those who had never seen a dragon consume food. He made his own coffee and sat across the table and looked at a screen that he folded away after a moment, and when she had reached a point of reasonable sufficiency, he set the screen on the table between them. It was the document. She read it 3 times. The first time because she was reading it. The second time because she was certain she had misread the figures and needed to check. The third time slowly, each clause, the way she would read something she intended to keep. "You put this together in 3 days," she said. "In 2, he said. The third day was transit time." He had his hands loosely folded on the table, the posture of a man presenting something he believed in without the performance of belief. "The Compact has been trying to establish a formal diplomatic presence on this world for 6 years. They've sent 4 different representatives. 3 of them made the same category of mistake, underestimating the degree to which certain cultures on this world respond to non-human intermediaries not as a novelty but as a signal of genuine commitment. The 4th did well personally but was recalled for unrelated reasons." He paused. "They need something that carries authority without carrying the specific cultural freight that human representatives carry here. Something with an established presence in this region. Something with demonstrated," he chose the word carefully, "judgment." "I pulled a child from a fire," she said. "You pulled a child from a fire when you were hungry and broke and no one was watching," he said. "Those are the conditions under which the test means something. When there's an audience and comfort and the outcome reflects on you in ways you can calculate, almost anyone performs adequately under those conditions. The test is what you do in the dark when there's nothing in it for you, when the cost is real." He met her eyes steadily. "You performed in the dark." She looked at the document, at the figures she had read 3 times and still couldn't entirely believe, at the clauses regarding residence material support, the formal charter that would make every future interaction with the Civil Watch considerably less complicated, and at the last section, the one she had read most slowly of all, the one labeled Territorial Restoration Provision. "The mountain," she said. Tell me about it, he said, if you're willing. She was quiet for a moment. The walls in her mind that surrounded that period were high and had been maintained with considerable care. She looked at them from the outside, gauging, and found that the ground around them had shifted somehow in the last 3 days in ways she had not been tracking consciously. Clan dispute, she said. It came out the same way it had the first time she'd said it to him, the previous night, simple, stripped, the essential facts without the surrounding material. My branch of the family and my elder cousin's branch, territory primarily, horde rights secondarily. It escalated over about 20 years in the slow way that draconic disputes escalate because we live long enough to be patient about our grievances. And you lost, he said, not with judgment, with the factual acknowledgement of someone who understood that outcomes could be recorded without being endorsed. I lost, she said. My cousin had more allies. I had been away. I had spent 60 years outside the mountain system, traveling, working with humans in several capacities, and I came back to find that in my absence the alliances that should have held had been quietly redistributed. She paused. I was not there. These things happen when one is not there. She heard the echo of what she had said to Ilna the previous night. You were elsewhere. These things happen when one is elsewhere. She had meant it kindly when she said it to Ilna. She found it was more complicated when applied to herself. The mountain is in the northern Cathara range, she said, 200 miles northeast of here. It has a name in the draconic register Vetharak in the old form. My family held it for 6 generations. She looked at her hands on the table, the dull claws, the scales that had lost their fire. I do not know what condition it is in now. My cousin held it for a time, and then I heard some years ago that there had been a secondary dispute. I did not follow the details. The Compact's archaeological and legal division works with territorial claims in contested mountain regions, Aaron said. It's one of their established functions in regions with non-human sapient populations. I've already had a preliminary conversation. He indicated the document. The restoration provision is not a promise. I want to be honest about that. It is a commitment to fund and facilitate the process. The outcome depends on what the investigation finds about the current claim status. I understand the difference, she said. I thought you would. She looked at him. You thought a great deal in 2 days about a dragon you had never met. I thought about what my son told me, he said. He notices things. Accurately, he told me about the woman in the nightdress pointing at the window and about the crowd watching and about the fact that you moved before anyone else had finished deciding whether to move. He paused. He told me you said you were just what was available. He told me that wrong. The almost smile again. He said, and I am quoting him precisely, she said she was just what was there, but Papa, she went in when it was still all fire. She didn't even stop, and I think she thought about it, but only for like 1 second, and then she just went. Verath was quiet. 1 second, Aaron said, is long enough to know you had the thought and short enough to tell you something about the person having it. She looked at the document for a long moment. She looked at the space around her, the ceiling that did not require her to hunch, the table that was sized for what she was rather than scaled down from it. She thought about the stable and the gap in the boards and the stars through it, and she thought about the way she had left the coin pouch behind without deciding to, had just set it down and walked out. There are things I need to understand about the diplomatic role, she said. Ask them. The specific cultures I would be working with, I know the regional groups by general reputation but not in detail. I will need proper briefings, not summary documents. Agreed and already arranged. And the residency terms. I need to know what adequate flame food means to the compact in practical terms, because adequate by one standard and adequate by another are very different conversations. Define adequate by your standard, he said, and I'll tell you if the compact can meet it. She told him. He did not flinch at the quantity. He wrote it on a smaller screen and noted and added in a way that suggested it was being incorporated into an actual record and not simply acknowledged to make her feel heard. One more thing, she said. Oh yes, your son has a notebook. Aaron Vasith's face underwent a brief but complete transformation. The controlled, professional quality, maintained so consistently that she had begun to think it was simply his nature, dissolved for approximately 3 seconds into something much less composed. He pressed his lips together. He looked at a point slightly above and to the left of her head. He does, he said, with the tone of a man exercising significant restraint. He has written dragon facts at the top of the first page, she said, with a question mark. That sounds, he stopped, that is accurate, yes. He asked me at the scene last night whether I actually breathed fire or whether it was more. She considered how to reproduce the exact phrasing, which had been precise in its imprecision, like. He asks things like that, Aaron said. He has been asking things like that since he was approximately 3. His teachers describe him as a persistently curious. His aunt describes him as relentless. I describe him as the almost small became briefly the real thing, full and unguarded in a way that changed his whole face, mine. The word landed softly in the space between them and stayed there. Vareth thought about Ilna saying he's everything, and the particular cosmology of it, the way certain people organized everything around a single point of gravity. She thought about Tamaz at the corner of the street in a borrowed blanket with absolute certainty about his father's nature. She thought about what it meant to be the thing someone organized themselves around, and what it meant to have lost the things that had once organized her. "You were 8 months away," she said. "Oh, yes. And you came back to find his building gone." Yes, his voice was even, maintained, the controlled quality back in place but differently now, not as a performance of calm but as a container for something that needed containment. "I was supposed to be back in 6 months. The salvage accounting ran over, I sent money, I arranged the charter renewal for the building, he stopped. The charter lapsed while I was in transit, the building management let it go, I didn't know." A pause. "I should have known." "You were elsewhere," Vareth said. He looked at her. "These things happen when one is elsewhere," she said quietly. "It is not exculpatory, but it is real." He was quiet for a moment with a quality of quiet that was doing something internal. "Yes," he said finally, "it is." She signed the document. She did not do it dramatically. She did not make a moment of it. She picked up the pen he slid toward her and she signed her name in the draconic script which she had not written in years and which came back to her claw-like muscle memory comes back, the deep kind, the kind that lives below conscious recall. The name she had been given on a mountain that still existed somewhere, that still had her family's marks on the stone of it even if it no longer had her presence. Aaron Vaseth witnessed it with his own signature, and folded the document with the careful movements of someone who understood that this piece of paper was going into a file that would shape a significant quantity of subsequent events. "Tamaz is with Ilna at the cousin's house," he said. "I'd like to bring him here. He's been asking to come since approximately 20 minutes after I docked." "I imagine he has questions," Vareth said. "He has an entire notebook of questions," Aaron said. "He would like me to tell you that he has done preliminary research in preparation, but I want to be transparent with you that his preliminary research consisted primarily of asking his cousin's children what they knew about dragons, and the combined knowledge of 3 children aged 4 to 9 is, he considered, enthusiastic rather than accurate." "How long does it take to walk from the cousin's house?" Vareth asked. 40 minutes by cart." "Then I have time," she said, "to explain the basic physiology before he arrives so that at least the framework questions will already be answered." Aaron stood and sent a message on his small screen, and then he sat back down across from her and he listened. With the same quality of attention his son had, focused, recording, not filling the space with his own reactions, but genuinely receiving what was offered, as she began from the beginning. Tamaz arrived at a run. She heard him before she saw him. Small feet on the ramp, quick and light, the sound of someone whose natural pace was faster than whatever adults around him were comfortable with. She heard Alna's voice behind, calling something that was probably slowed down in a tone that suggested it had been said several times already today and had not had its intended effect. He came through the hatchway and stopped. Not because he was startled, he had clearly been building up to this for 3 days and was not going to allow himself to be startled, but because he had arrived and he was taking stock of what arriving meant. His eyes found Vareth immediately and he did what he had done on the cobblestones, assessed, catalogued, filed. Then he held up the notebook. It was small with a green cover, and it had been held enough to have the slightly soft quality of something carried in a pocket for several days. He crossed the room with the proprietary ease of a child who had decided that a space was safe, not asking permission, not checking whether proximity was welcome, simply arriving in the place where the interesting thing was and sat down on the seat beside her with his notebook open on his knee. "Okay," he said. "First question, the fire. Is it, how does it work from the inside? Because outside it looks like it just comes out, but there must be something that." "There is a structure," Vareth said, "behind the sternum." Here, she indicated the relevant anatomy on herself. "That functions as a compression chamber. The initial fuel is a biological compound, specific to dragons, produced by a secondary organ," here, she indicated again, "and the combustion occurs at the moment of expulsion when it contacts the air and the structural." "Is it like a flint?" he said. "Like a flint and steel kind of does something strike something?" "Not precisely, more like a," she thought, "a valve that opens under pressure. The compound is under compression at rest, and the opening of the valve against the air creates them. So you could do it underwater if the pressure was different." She stopped, she looked at him. He was watching her with the pencil ready, and his expression said clearly that this was a genuine question that had followed logically from what she had just said, and he was waiting for the answer with no awareness that the speed of the inference might be surprising. Across the table, Aaron Vaseth was looking at his coffee with the expression of a man who had been surprised many times in this specific way, and had not developed immunity to it. That is, Varath said carefully, a more sophisticated question than most people ask. But can you, Tamaz said. The answer, she said, is complicated, and I am going to give it to you fully, but you need to write the follow-up question down first rather than asking it immediately when it arrives, or we will be here until the evening. Tamaz wrote something in the notebook. He held it up. He had written follow-up QSTONS hold and underlined it twice. She heard Aaron make a sound into his coffee that was not quite a laugh, but was its immediate neighbor. Ilna had come in behind Tamaz and settled into a seat near the hatchway with the particular quiet of a person who had found, in the last 3 days, that her reserves of energy were not yet replenished, and who was grateful for a place to sit that did not require anything of her. She looked at Varath with the same expression she had worn in the street, the one that still had things in it that had not found words, and Varath met her gaze and held it for a moment, and then turned back to Tamaz and his notebook. Outside, the morning had become fully itself. The fog had burned away from the market square, and the light came in through the vessel's narrow windows at a long, low angle, falling across the table where Varath sat, her dull scales and her worn claws and her name signed on a document that was going to change what the next century looked like, and the small boy with the green notebook who was already on his second follow-up question and had not yet remembered he was supposed to be writing them down. She had left the coin pouch in the stable. She did not think she was going to need it. She breathed in, and there was something in the air of the vessel, recycled, filtered, carrying the cold of space in trace amounts. That was unlike any air she had breathed in 11 years of elsewhere, and she could not have said precisely why that mattered, but it did. She began to explain how a dragon breathed fire. She explained it fully and carefully, and from the beginning, the way she would explain something to someone who intended to understand it rather than simply to have been told it. She explained the compression chamber and the valve and the specific temperature of the combustion point, and the way the flame could be modulated from a breath to a roar depending on what was needed. She explained the way it felt from the inside, which was the question she had been working up to answering because no one had ever asked it before, the specific warm pressure of it, the sense of something that was entirely continuous with your own body expressing itself outward into the world. Tamaz filled 4 pages. Aaron refilled her food twice without being asked and his own coffee 3 times, and did not speak unless she addressed him directly, which was the behavior of someone who understood when to hold the space. There was time now to explain things properly. There was time for the notebook and the questions and the careful translation of what it meant to be what she was into language that a boy with a pencil could carry with him. There was time for the document and the mountain and the long work of whatever came next. She had been what was available. She had walked into the fire when the fire needed walking into, and she had come out the other side with her scales still dull and her claws still worn and 1 3/4 copper she had left behind on purpose. And she had come out with something else too, the small handprints of soot on her foreleg already faded, and the specific weight of having been needed by something small at the exact moment when needed was what she had to offer. The morning moved forward. The city outside came fully awake. And in the market square of Dun Kessara, where a vessel sat on scorched cobblestones with the darkness of space still cooling in its hull, a dragon explained herself to a boy who was writing everything down. And outside the narrow windows the light was very clear and the day was, by any reasonable measure, beginning.